Well, welcome, and thank you all for attending, but most importantly, thanks to Nemonte and Mitch for joining us today. It's going to be a different Mishcon Academy because we've got translation happening simultaneously. But first of all, I just wanted to thank Mitch and Nemonte for coming to join us. We have a rich seam of people through the Academy at Mishcon, and this is a fantastic opportunity for us to all learn a little bit more about the world, and particularly Nemonte's world. So we're talking today with Nemonte Nenquimo and Mitch Anderson, who Nemonte is author of this wonderful book, which I commend to you and we'll be talking about today, We Will Not Be Saved. But perhaps more importantly is from the Ecuadorian rainforest, from the Amazon, and has dedicated her life to being an activist protecting the lands that she grew up in and the lands that are so important in her history and culture. And ultimately, the story is one about, it's a fantastic story because it's a story about Nemonte's early childhood, her growth in the forest, her early years in a world that was seeing missionary activity in Ecuador, the very early stages of oil exploration in Ecuador, all relayed in the book through the eyes of a child. And that's the first half of the book. And the second half of the book is very much about the journey into adulthood and the loss of innocence, the complexity and challenges that come with adulthood, and ultimately to a point where Nemonte was involved in a landmark case against the Ecuadorian government, protecting 500,000 acres of the Amazon rainforest from oil exploration. And the juxtaposition of this wonderful story of childhood in the forest through to almost the brutality of being in a courtroom facing the government in Ecuador is a remarkable story. And I think perhaps most importantly is a true story. So it really is a privilege to be here with Nemonte today. And it's a book that's about so much. I came to this book as a lawyer thinking, well, this is a really interesting book about a landmark legal case. But actually it's a book about the reality of standing up for Indigenous rights. It's a book about the forest as a place, as an environment, as an ecosystem. It's about culture, it's about history, it's about the church, it's about exploitation and coercion, and all of the complexities and interrelations that we see in life. So a fascinating real life story about life in Ecuador, life in the rainforest, and I'd very much commend it to you. Perfect. So thank you. I wanted to, we'll talk in the next hour or so about the case and what that experience was like. We'll talk about a little bit about Amazon Frontlines, which is the organisation which Mitch is a founder and executive of, and which has been behind bringing the case and some future work protecting rights. We'll talk about the experiences and sometimes difficult experiences that Nemonte had growing up. But I want to just start with the book. It's really clear, Nemonte, through the story that storytelling is very important in your childhood, in your culture, and in your environment. And I wonder whether that tradition of storytelling was what brought you to writing the book, or whether it was something else.
Gracias por este espacio, por dar esa oportunidad. Yo soy una mujer guaraní, soy Nemonte, vengo de muy lejos de la Amazonía del Ecuador.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here. I'm a Guarani woman, and my name is Nemonte Nenquimo, and I've come from very far away.
Pues esa historia para mí es muy especial, para mi papá, para mí también. Mi cultura no somos escritores, nuestra cultura es oral. Nosotros contamos en las mañanas y en las noches y actividades que hacemos en el día de diario vivir. Y cuando llegamos en nuestra casa empezamos a contar qué han hecho la abuela o mamá, hermano. Es nuestra rutina de la vida, es la forma oral.
For me, this story and being able to tell this story in a book is very special. In my culture, as Matt was saying, It's a culture of oral storytelling, which means that we love to tell stories and we love to listen to stories, and we tell stories every day. In the morning, we tell our dreams. In the evening, we tell what we've done during the day, and everybody gathers in the longhouse and we share stories from the forest, from the garden, from the river.
Pues este libro nace conociendo a mi esposo, que es Mitch, y también él, mi compañero de vida, vivió conmigo, ¿no? Vivió, experimentó en la selva, con mi familia, con mi papá, con mis hermanos, y también en la lucha que hacemos el trabajo en nuestro territorio. Es grande, ¿no? Es muy grande nuestro territorio y es un lugar tesoro, que tenemos todo debajo de nuestra tierra: petróleo, minería, bosques gigantescos que miles de años nuestros ancestros protegían y respetaban. Entonces, a lo largo de ese proceso trabajando, dimos cuenta los dos que era necesario, importante, para contar historia al mundo.
The reason why we were able to write a book together has to do with the fact that Mitch and I became partners, husband and wife, and life partners. And he lived with me in my territory, learned about our culture, learned how to fish and hunt and go into the forest. And we also worked together to protect the territory and protect the land against extraction, against oil, and against mining, because my territory is vast and it's a treasure chest of resources that the world is always wanting to exploit from us. And after fighting for many years to protect our land, we realized that it was the time to tell the deep story of my people to the world.
Y ese proceso era algo muy hermoso. Viví yo con Mitch y era volver a contar, preguntar a mi papá, a mi mamá, a mis hermanos, y Mitch tenía que escuchar y Mitch tenía que grabar, o a veces Mitch escribía toda mi memoria de mi niñez, y para mí era especial de recordar toda la memoria, de revivir con mi hermano, especialmente con Hopi. Era muy bonito, y mi mamá, mi papá contaban y nos acordábamos, y Mitch tenía que escribir con colores, agendas, así escribía y dejaba. Y también íbamos en chacra o en pesca, decía Mitch, nosotros cuando éramos niñas cruzábamos así con mi hermano. O sea, Mitch, el papel de mi esposo no era como un estudiante que viene, un antropólogo o un periodista que viene un mes, que escribe, redacta y ya va a hacer su libro. Era Mitch que vivió con mi familia, vivió quiénes somos nosotros, Guarani, muchos años en su territorio.
And so the process of writing this book was really interesting and special and fun. We lived together in the forest, and when we decided to write a book together, I got to relive all of my memories from my childhood, memories that I had forgotten, beautiful times with my younger brothers, my older brother, Opie, Victor. And it was also special because Mitch was listening to me tell my stories, and we were talking to my parents and other elders of the communities to remember our upbringing, to remember the times before our people were contacted. And we were even telling stories as we would cross the river in canoe or go into the garden, and I would remember different memories, and Mitch would be writing them down, and he had different colored notebooks that he would write down. And one thing that's important to say is that it wasn't like an anthropologist or a journalist that comes for a month to try to like figure everything out and write a book, but we did this over the course of many years.
Y era algo hermoso cuando todos teníamos listo, y yo di segundo bebé, mi bebé niño, y siguiente día Mitch ya dijo, Nemo, hoy tu historia, su memoria, su historia de su pueblo voy a encerrar en cuarto a escribir. Y me recuerdo que yo tenía a mi bebé, salía Mitch en el cuarto, cerró y empezó a teclear computadora así. Y de repente mi padre llegó en la casa, dijo, Nemo, ¿dónde está Mitch? Yo necesito llevar en la chacra, a ayudar a partir leña, pero ahora. Yo dije, papá, Mitch está escribiendo mi memoria, historia de nuestro pueblo y nuestra lucha. Y él no entendió y regresó a su casa. Y las 3 de la tarde volvió, y yo estaba en la cocina cocinando, caminando afuera en el bosque, y mi papá viene sudado, así, con short, así, sin camisa. Nemo, Mitch, ¿dónde está? ¿Ya terminó la historia?
She said it was funny as well because when I gave birth to our second child, Soul, the next day, Mitch said that he was ready to begin writing this book. And so we had built a house in the forest, and there was a little room where he, went in and began typing. We could hear him on the typewriter beginning to write the story. And then my dad showed up and he said, "Mom, where's Mitch? I need to go into the forest. He needs to cut wood with me. We need more firewood." And I said, "Dad, we already talked about this. He's going to be writing the book now." And then Dad looked very contemplative. And then he came back at about 3 in the afternoon. He was like sweaty. And he comes back and he says, "Nim, where's Mitch? Has he finished the book yet?" She's like, "No, no."
Y
3 years later,
yo estoy todavía muy orgullosa y tengo mucha emoción que voy a volver ahora con esto en mi casa, decir papá. Ahora, esto volvió, recuerda, 3 años Mitch siguió viviendo, transformando, escribiendo y voy a llevar. Y mi papá lo único que va a hacer es abrir y quizás va a haber foto. Nuestra cultura es mirar, ¿no? Y escuchar. Y no somos lectores ni menos escritores. Es como, yo miro que es muy especial y me gustaría como leer mi introducción de mi historia para que Mitch pueda leer en inglés la introducción.
he says, "So I'm really excited to be able to bring this book back finally and show it to my dad and say, look, this is the book that we wrote, Dad. This is the book that we took 3 years to write." And it's also just a very special moment because the book is going on a journey, and it's the first book that my people have ever written because we've always been an oral storytelling culture. And so if it's all right, she said, I'd like to read the introduction to the book in my own language. And then Mitch is going to read it in English.
Perfect. Thank you.
Que un omoni taron que haya gawa omerengo kimi, ono aroke. Gawara mai e go kingobi, mani apene cantapa tomemo mempo. Boto doka apenikimo tomemo que vingainko añomo dobe eñin antapa, boto apenike. Dorani que vingairi, dobe babano pono arani. Poma arani. Panka ekene apenera mai inte impa ve woronte nen tome eñemamo. Warepo ba poñonte dobe eñinani tapa. Tomemo girinani ekene anani wa impa anamai. Mano mai kete epugamen que venani tapa. Vete namai koworen tono onoboka ño keramai.
Walk down the trail, then veer off into forest, leaving no tracks. This was my father's counsel when I told him that I'd be telling my story to you. I knew what he meant, that my ancestors would be watching, that their stories that must remain hidden, secrets that must be guarded. Across the centuries, my people learned not to trust you. That's how we stayed alive, unconquered, by leaving no tracks.
Monito ve en dorani que gainko minko men que venpa mani ekene wa que me monipa tome moni oko monito mere monito vepe monito mimo e amini que mi moni menye bain wa ore mai o a aweiri bain wo go adoban yeyeri bain wok que teemon ponemoni adani daime kene wak ventempo tamonga ñan keka kene vimas venonte veniante come waron bapa manin be dobe ñemopa kinante aye minani anani dorani kegai dobe venpa ekame apenera mai inani ante.
For us, stories are living beings. They breathe life into our homes, into our forests. They pulse in our blood, in our dreams. They stalk us like jaguars, clack like peccary, sail like macaws, run like fish. They're powerful beings. Like rainbows, they bring peace. Like lightning, they bring war. And they're always changing. That's how we know that they are alive. A story dies when no one tells it.
Monito que venga inko llevemos na mai inani tapa va ante va adoke bai bote yekene va bai imopa. Wabano bako apenebo, bako nyono mopa, uno boca bai. Kinganon kerani, tomemoni kevin ainko, dobe yebe momopa, amini kevin imoni.
Our stories have never been written down, not like this. Part of me is scared. Have I told too much? Left too many tracks? What will you do with my story now that it has been written? I hope you will let it live.
Thank you. I think that gives a really good sense of the way the whole book operates, which is it's deep in content, it's rich in imagery, and it's rich in history as well. And I think, as well as being a fascinating story in its own right, the writing, the way it's written, the expression is absolutely fascinating. Mitch, there's a or both of you, in fact, there's a fantastic part in the story where Nemonte asks, why do white people read so many books? And Mitch replies, because they see a little part of themselves in the stories of others. And I thought this was a fascinating idea and a fascinating concept. And I wondered whether, Nemonte, you had learned something of yourself in writing the story.
Sí, es como mi niñez, es como algo muy bonito, de tener ese espacio hermoso en la selva, mis tíos, mi papá, y también sentí a la vez que venía de afuera, entrando en mi territorio, hablando de salvación, hablando de Jesucristo y nuestra propia creencia diciendo que es diablo, ¿no? Y había dos cosas como muy interesantes y a la vez era muy miedo, el que limita, que no puedes como pensar como bloquea, ¿no?
She said, first thing is that as a woman now reliving my story of my childhood, I really was able to realize that I grew up in the middle of the rainforest in a village that was torn by two worlds. It was a beautiful upbringing with my aunties and uncles and grandparents, learning about the forest, songs, medicine. And at the same time, there were missionaries that were in our village that told us that our culture was the devil and that we needed to learn about Jesus Christ and that was the only way that we would be saved. And when I was growing up, it was hard to understand what that was doing to me.
Yeah, no, I can see that, and that idea that there is a need to be saved is a very strong idea in the book, and I think there's an interesting thread that goes from the title of the book, which is "We Will Not Be Saved," through to a comment you made about the court case, where perhaps this court case would save the white people, the uncivilized, as they're called the civilized, as they're called in the book, from themselves. And I wondered how important that idea of salvation was in the story.
Pues muchas veces sentimos como que todo lo que viene de afuera viene con intención de ayudar, como que miran, estoy haciendo bien, pero realmente sin conocer el raíz, la cultura y el poder y el conocimiento como de afuera encima viene, desvalorizan, piensan que están haciendo bien y estás haciendo mal. Estás como a lo largo de eso yo di cuenta realmente que fui sacado de los evangélicos, fui para estudiar afuera y yo pensaba que estaba aprendiendo bien, pero realmente yo di cuenta de que eso no estaba bien. Uno mismo tiene que salvarse, uno mismo tiene que salirse de ese mundo que te viene a invadir, ¿no? Entonces eso me ayudó el espacio de selva, de estar sano, de mirar la cultura y valorar y respeto. Entonces eso como que me ayudó a entender que el mundo miran de que está haciendo bien, como a veces penetran como arrogancia. Yo protejo esto o yo digo esto, estoy salvando, pienso. Esto no es el camino de salvar, de hacer, sino es respetar. Y eso, como mi carne propio, he vivido y he descubrido eso. Por eso mismo estoy como escribiendo que no seremos salvados. Uno a otro debemos respeto, necesitamos respeto. No que estamos llegando de fuera y tampoco la selva está esperando que vienen a salvar. La selva es intacta. Ella es intacta. Los pueblos indígenas tenemos principio de tener esa conexión de respeto que nuestros antepasados han enseñado, ¿no?
She said, as a child and as a Warani woman, I've noticed in my own experience in life that many people have come into our territory, the missionaries and others, with this idea that the Warani people needed to be saved, that we needed to be helped, that we didn't know enough. And maybe they came with good intentions, but ultimately that arrogance, that lack of desire to understand us, but rather just to save us and to help us, has caused a lot of harm to me, to my people, and to my culture. And I also see that, Nemonte said, in the world today, where we're facing a lot of threats to Mother Earth. And what I've learned as a woman, because I feel it in my body, is that Mother Earth is also not asking to be saved. She's demanding that we respect her. And the Warani people are demanding the same, that we are respected. And as a young girl, it was hard for me to understand all of this. And so I listened to the missionaries and I thought that, I was bright and that I was going to learn from them. And so I followed them and I followed them out of the forest and I tried to learn their ways. And ultimately, I realized that I was doing harm to myself. They were doing harm to me, and that I had been losing the trail, and that I needed to return to the forest and respect and value my own culture. And one of the messages of this book is not a gloomy message about everything is going to hell, but really it's that we need to save ourselves. No one's going to come to save us, and Mother Earth demands that we respect her.
And I think that's really interesting, because it's that idea of respect is integral in terms of what you need from people outside. But I also got a strong sense in the book that there was a need to preserve dignity, and that's something we preserve ourselves. We stop people eroding our dignity. So there was the two themes of dignity and respect going in parallel. The book is not it's an uplifting story in many ways, but it's a very challenging story. In Nemonte, you've experienced some very difficult things in your life, and you talk about those very openly in the book. And a lot of the language, to me, is the language of exploitation and abuse. And I wonder whether that was intentional and it was meant to be a metaphor for how you feel about how your lands are being treated, or whether it was simply about how you were treated personally.
Sí, para mí era muy importante, duro, difícil como mujer, pero a la vez yo sentí diciendo la verdad, contando eso como valiente, como mujer valiente y con mucha fuerza, decir que era una terapia también. Ese libro es una terapia que me hizo sentir libre. Ahora soy una mujer libre, listo para poder fortalecer a las demás mujeres.
She said, thank you for asking about abuse and exploitation. And yeah, I've lived through a lot of pain and violence towards me. And as a woman, I buried it for a long time. And this book was an opportunity to be courageous and to be vulnerable, to unbury a lot of the stories inside of me. And ultimately, it was a healing process. It was a therapy to be able to tell my story, confide in my story, write my story down, share it with the world. And I became stronger through the process of writing this book with Mitch. And ultimately, I feel free And that's a beautiful feeling, and it's a feeling that I'm proud of, because I want this book, this story, to uplift women around the world, and I want to be able to accompany and support women leaders, women on the front lines around the world, to tell their stories, to be leaders in this movement, in this world.
And I think we'll definitely talk about leadership, because I think that's one of the strong senses I got about what the next chapter for you, Nemonte, is about. But before we do that, it's clear in the book that you've lived in two very different worlds. You've grown up in the forest. You've lived in the city. You've experienced the West and the Western world. And I wondered whether that had been very difficult for you, and whether you felt that had made you stronger or weaker, and where you now felt was home.
Quiero saber dónde es tu casa ahora, dónde sientes casa en casa.
Yo realmente siento mi casa es la selva, porque la selva es todo, ¿no? Y siento que mientras la selva está sana, yo también soy sana. Si mientras la selva está enferma, yo también voy a enfermar y voy a desconectar de donde soy, de esa raíz. Entonces, mientras la selva está, yo agradezco a mis abuelos, a los ancestros, que el espíritu todavía me guía y todavía tenemos esa diversidad, 80% de diversidad que da vida al mundo. Entonces, para mí es muy importante la vida del mundo de este sistema. Yo veo que es muy fuerte, que desconecta espiritualmente, separa a su familia mismo. Ya no puedes vivir feliz con tu familia, con tu papá, con tu mamá, de colectividad y armonía. Estamos teniendo el sistema de un patrón que manda. Dependemos de ese sistema, también nos afecta la salud.
He said the forest is my home. The forest is definitely my home, because the forest gives life to me, gives life to my people. When the forest is healthy, I feel healthy and alive. When the forest is threatened, or if the forest is sick, then I feel sick and I feel threatened. And for me, I've realized, and I have traveled and lived in cities and seen the world, and I've understood now that it's really hard for people living in the cities and living in this system, because what the system does is little by little, it breaks up community, it erodes families, it makes people feel oftentimes like just individuals isolated in the world. And for me as a Warani woman, that's very hard, because we're come from a collective communal family and culture in the forest. And so it's been very challenging for me to adapt and adjust spiritually to life in the cities. I oftentimes find myself feeling disconnected as well from Mother Earth, because it's hard. Because you're not going out into the forest and bringing home food, or the rivers, or the garden. But definitely the forest is my home.
And do you think you had to experience those other environments to be able to challenge them, to take them on, and to operate within that system?
A mí mucho que me impactó era mi propio pueblos indígenas, que en el Ecuador viven norte, igual que nosotros, tenían su cultura, su conocimiento, su canto, su armonía, su territorio limpio, como nosotros tenemos ahora. Cuando conocí a mi pareja Mitch, y cuando hicimos movimiento de Mitch mismo me invitó a ir allá, ahí a mí me nació coraje que tanto sufrían las mujeres con la enfermedad de cáncer, pérdida de cultura mismo, violencias familiares, alcohol y muchas cosas. Entonces yo di cuenta, pensé que si yo me quedo así viviendo, este mundo está muy bueno, que está llegando internet o cosas, voy a perder mi territorio, mi cultura. Y todo va a afectar a mi familia guaraní y al mundo. Entonces, eso fue como la unidad con la que enfrentaron, que tiene territorio pequeño, con mi pueblo, que vienen de todavía cultura muy, muy grande, muy fuerte, espiritual. Entonces, eso es lo que a mí me hizo nacer el semilla, el movimiento como un trabajo mujer, no más esperar. Hay que hacer, como eso fue un movimiento de unir con otros pueblos para poder enfrentar de lo que viene en mi territorio en la puerta. Porque mi territorio es un lugar grande, es una amenaza día a día, porque tenemos recursos debajo de nuestra tierra.
She said, for me, it was really important to leave Warani territory in my forest, where there are no roads and there's no oil drilling, there's no mining, and learn about the Kofan and Siona and Sequoia peoples in Ecuador's northern Amazon. And it was Mitch, who was already working with those tribes in the northern part of the Amazon, building access to clean water, who invited me to see an oil spill that had happened there. And it was through that experience of seeing the oil fields in the middle of the forest and the oil spills and meeting women who had stories of, who had cancer, stories of losing their children to oil spills, to contamination, to miscarriages, and seeing how those tribes had lost so much of their territory and how they'd been surrounded by oil companies and mining companies and African palm plantations and colonist towns. And then that's when I realized that the world is invading, and it's also trying to entice the indigenous youth with all of these things, with clothes and with the internet and cell phones. And if I, as a young woman, as a Warani woman, go that route and succumb to consumerism, then what I'm going to lose is my entire culture and my entire territory. And what's going to happen is soon what I'm seeing here in the oil fields of Ecuador's northern Amazon is going to happen in my territory. And that was what gave me the conviction and the courage and the desire to say, no, we're going to organize now. We need to bring our tribes together, and we need to share our strategies, and we need to build a movement to protect our lands, to protect our water against invasion, and protect our culture.
And I think that experience is really well portrayed in the book, because the momentum begins when you've had that experience outside the forest. And I want to talk a little bit about leadership, because I think at some levels this is also a book about leadership. And it's clear from the first part of the book, to me anyway, that you as a young girl, as an adolescent, were slightly disruptive. You were very curious. You had spirit, and to some extent, it was obvious you were going to take a leadership role. You had that character. When did you know you either wanted to become a leader or that you had to become a leader? And what does leadership mean to you?
Yo pienso, mientras yo crecía desde niña, yo sentía algo nuevo, cambio en mi territorio, que venían no solo misioneros, alrededor de mí llegaba helicópteros en mi territorio, como diciendo que llegamos para solucionar el problema, para buen vivir, salud y la casa vivienda. En ese tiempo, cuando era niña, no entendía bien. Y cuando ya fui grande y me fui a vivir, ver, como siempre habla en cartel en el Ecuador, el desarrollo del buen vivir es petróleo. Entonces, cuando yo me iba y veía derrames diarios donde los otros pueblos bañan y lavan los niños, y eso a mí no me pareció muy sano, que los petroleros, para que no los pueblos indígenas salen a hacer denuncia en la prensa, que lo que daban eran 2 atunes y un sal, y nuestra forma de vida culturalmente, nosotros con 2 atunes, latas que daban, no es suficiente por 15 días. Entonces ahí a mí salió como rebeldía y un coraje, decir que esto no vamos a permitir que la gente de afuera o de empresas, menos gobiernos que nos venga a nuestra tierra a quitar, nuestra agua a limpiar, como despreciar y humillar. Entonces, ahí me nació como una mujer de valentía y una mujer de coraje. Y mientras hablamos, yo veía cómo experimentaba, para los hombres era fácil trabajar en la petrolera, ir a trabajar y emborrachar. Pero para mujer se sentía como cuidar al bebé, estar con bebé, ir a la chacra y traer, eso como que sentía que no estaba bien, que hay que hacer algo, hay que unir. Entonces, mientras íbamos dando agua limpia, íbamos conversando en la mañana en ayunas. Y yo veo que nos ayudó como nacer como qué somos nosotros y qué debemos de enfrentar. Era bebida de yoco, bebida de como colectivo, como redondo, hablando, acordando en nuestros ancestros esa forma. Antes de civilizar 2 millones de hectáreas administraban. Y ahora nosotros estamos hablando español y hemos ido en la escuela. ¿Por qué no podemos enfrentar? ¿Por qué no podemos decir que esto no vamos a permitir? Entonces ahí nace el mapeo.
For her, she remembers those days when she first traveled to Ecuador's northern Amazon and saw the oil fields, and she saw the oil company signs that said that oil is progress, oil is development. And past those signs was the river filled with crude oil, stained with crude oil. And there were indigenous families, the Kofan people, Siona people, Sequoia peoples, living on the banks of those rivers. The river is its source of life, water, and the companies had given them as compensation for poisoning their rivers little grocery bags of a couple cans of tuna and cooking oil and a couple gallons of water. And for Nemonte, it was this affront to dignity, this this degrading offering to indigenous peoples who had been poisoned, whose lives had been disrupted for decades, and then they had the gall to just give little grocery bags to the communities. And she felt rage, and she felt that we can't let this happen, and I can't let this happen to my people. And it was in that moment where she also realized that this world is set up for men. The oil companies are set up so the men can go and they can become wage laborers, and they can work in the day with the machete, and they'll take the money and they'll go get drunk in the town. The women are there maintaining the family, the community, the garden, the children, thinking about the future. And so we began building access to clean water with Nemonte's people. And she began working with the women and learning about how women of her tribe in different parts of the territory that had been invaded by oil had experienced the oil company contamination and this new culture. And it was really through drinking sacred plant medicines and highly caffeinated plant beverages in the morning, in a circle, women with elders, really beginning to think about collectively what is our vision and our dream for our forests and our cultures, and what do we need to do, that she began feeling what leadership must look like in this moment.
And Mitch, you were part of Nemonte's life at that point, and as you were leading up to the galvanizing that sense of community and thinking about bringing an action, a court case, was that a scary time or an exhilarating time?
Tú diga, porque yo era listo para enfrentar, no tenía miedo de nada.
Because if you're asking about fear, then I can answer, I wasn't afraid of anything. Maybe you can answer.
You get that sense in the book, yeah.
I can give a little background too. So I'm not from the Amazon. I didn't grow up in the forest. I grew up in the city, and I grew up didn't really plant my own food. Never hunted an animal. Bring home food for the family, like it is like it is in indigenous cultures in the Amazon. Didn't really know like where the water came from, where the garbage went when you put it out on the street. And so, my life changed a lot, by living with and working with and learning from indigenous cultures across Central and South America. And I began working in 2007 in the Ecuadorian Amazon, and I began working on court cases actually against the oil industry in Peru and Ecuador. Two very different experiences of big international campaigns against the oil industry. And for several years, was supporting indigenous communities to wage these big international campaigns, public relations, shareholder activism, all this kind of stuff. And I always had this sense inside that the oil companies couldn't be the owners of justice. Like justice wasn't in their pockets, like the communities. There must be a way for the communities to build justice and build solutions from the ground up. Um, and I moved down to the Amazon in 2011 and asked the indigenous communities affected by Chevron's oil contamination if we could start a project together. What would we focus on? And there was a big discussion. Was it around health or education or water? And they ended up saying, let's build a project that will make sure that every indigenous family affected by oil contamination has access to clean water. And so I moved to the Amazon in 2011 and began this project, which had a simple goal of providing rainwater catchment systems with biosand filtration to indigenous communities, and at the same time make sure that the indigenous villages, the youth, the dreamers, were the ones that had ownership over the project, and that were learning about fundraising and project management and budgeting and all the technical pieces of building the systems and working with their communities to maintain the systems. And it was through that all of these different amazing indigenous youth and elders gravitated towards this project, and we began working together across many different nations in like one of the most threatened forests on the planet, and realizing that there was power in this, there was power in working together. And it was through that experience that I met Nemonte, and she began working to build clean water in communities, the Warani communities affected by oil. And all of this is in the book, so I won't repeat everything. But we fell in love, and we together helped build an alliance between the nations, and we founded Amazon Frontlines together. And we always knew that, deep down, the system and the Ecuadorian government was going to try to auction off her people's lands to the oil industry, because in 2012 they had launched this big oil auction across 7 million acres of forest covering over 10 indigenous nations, and they consulted the people by flying in planes and handing out colas and bread, and promising them a lot of health clinics and school systems, um, but ultimately the Ecuadorian government was trying to auction off under like terms that the oil industry didn't think was favorable, and so the auction didn't work. But the government said that they had the signatures, the indigenous communities had already signed off, and so we always knew that they were going to do it again. And you asked about fear or excitement. It was an exciting time,
Yeah.
building the Cebu Alliance and Amazon Frontlines. We built an organizing center in the outskirts of an oil town called Lago Agrio, which is named Sour Lake, which is named after Texaco's headquarters in Texas. And journalists that came to visit called it the WeWork of the jungle. There were monkeys and parrots and Wi-Fi in the jungle, and there was 50 people between speaking 10 languages. And we were building water systems and solar systems and doing trainings on technology, and we had rights trainings and building out economic associations with women, and recovering traditional healing systems, and building out maps of the entire forest, living maps, as a way to show the world that these forests were the ancestral lands of indigenous peoples, and there's no room for oil wells. There was no room for mining. And that was really the wisdom of Nemonte and of her father and of the elders, saying the world thinks that this forest is just huge and just like vacant and empty, and just ready for the taking. And so what we need to do is show them that it's full of life. And so, by the time that the government tried to auction off the land, we had already been working on a multi-year process to build territorial maps and water systems and solar systems and communities. And the Warani people were ready to go to war, ready to go to battle. And that's part of the story.
It's all part of the story, and that contrast is really apparent in the way you have constructed the book, because there's maybe 60,000 words build this rich image of a forest with all the complexity and life within it, and then the government simply describe it as Block 22, and that it's so you've lived with this for days of reading, and then suddenly it's auction of block 22. And I think that, to me, that really conveys that point you were making about the lack of understanding of the richness of the forest. So I can't think of a more different environment than a courtroom. How did both of you bring the story into the courtroom? How did you show the Warani people in the courtroom?
Sí, y eso es muy interesante, muy especial para mí. Cuando entramos, ya los abogados del gobierno, del hidrocarburo, estaban con corbata, serios. Nos veían a nosotros con achote, con nuestra lanza, sin zapato, todo con nuestra herramienta. Las plantas llevamos, planta que nos da vida, y nuestra selva es nuestra casa. Vamos, y la verdad. Fuimos y todos estaban como mirando, los abogados con papeles, con sus leyes. Estaba en la mesa las leyes. Entonces nosotros, con muy humilde, con nuestra sabiduría, con nuestro espiritual ancestral, estuvimos sentados también mirando hacia los jueces. Y la abuela me cogía mi mano y dijo: Nemo, nosotros vamos a ganar, dijo hoy día. Y yo dije sí, pero yo como mujer joven estaba un poco nerviosa, porque veo los abogados están con leyes, y nosotros solamente con lanza, con nuestros chigras, con nuestros corona y con nuestras pinturas. Y ellos empezaron a leer, y lo que a mí me encantó ese corte era que una mujer guarani mayor que no habla español, no entiende, que teníamos que jurar, decir la verdad. Y era testiga ella, y había un traductor, y que decía: si tú dices, jura la verdad, si tú mientes, 10 años vas a ir preso. ¿Vas a jurar sí o no?, preguntaron en y ella respondió no. Eso es lo que a mí me gustó más. Y volvían a repetir, decir: si tú no juras decir la verdad, vas a ir preso por 10 años. Ella decía no. ¿Puedes traducir?
Well, I said that for her, she really thinks this is a special moment, and likes this question about how it was to be a Warani woman and Warani person within the courtroom. And, for her, she was a young leader. She was the lead plaintiff, and she was the first elected woman of her tribe. And she was sitting with her elders in the courtroom, and there was the government lawyers were with their suits, and they had their ties on, their briefcases, and they had their manila envelopes and their books, that were, for her, it was full of the law. They had the law on their table. And what we had, my face was painted with a chote.
Lanza tenía, lanza.
With macaw feathers. And we carried in our chontapalm, or peach palm spears. And we had our peach palm machetes, so machetes made of wood. And we had plants. We had bundles of plants. We wanted to bring in forest and the sacred medicines of the forest into the courtroom. And the judges were there, and I was trying to make eye contact with the judges and feel and for them to feel the power of my people. But at the same time, I was nervous, and my elders were, they were very confident. They had dreamed, that we were going to win this court case. And Nemo was now saying, that she remembers one moment which actually isn't in the book. It was removed. We took it out of the book before we had the editors, you know. So this will be interesting. This will be interesting for you. But there was a moment where one of the elders, Nemo said that we were barefoot as well. We were barefoot, we were humble. We were trying to root our toes and our feet into the earth, you know, but it was just a courthouse. And there was a moment where one of our elders needed to swear the oath, you know, that she was going to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help her God. And she was standing there, and there was a Warani translator. And so the judge was looking at her and saying, you know, do you swear to tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth, so help me God? And if you don't, you'll go to jail. This will be perjury, you know, be perjury or whatever, you know. Perjury, what is it? Yeah. Perjury. And she said, no. And the judge was like, okay, translator, please, can you ask her, will she tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Otherwise, there'll be problems. And she said, no. And they, and she,
Eso era más poder
and she
cuando...
continued on for maybe like an hour, where she just refused to subjugate herself to a system that was going to put her in jail based on them determining what was true or not. She just would not do it. Okay, we'll move on.
There's also a beautiful moment where the court case is adjourned because you won't stop singing.
Y hay otro momento cuando se cierra la corte porque no dejan de cantar.
Y ahí luego decían que iban también como, había muchos, más eran comunidades que salieron, eran muchas mujeres, por el espacio no dejaban entrar adentro, estaban afuera. Y también era algo muy poderoso que mi prima llegó embarazada y haciendo protesta, cantando, dio luz allá en la sala afuera también, era muy... Sentí yo como muy poderosa ante todo, ahí como que sentí como que ellos siempre van a venir a engañar, decir que hicieron bien. Era un gran ejemplo que a mí me aprendí también dentro de Fuese, era que la señora Waurani, que era abuela, que no entendía, dijo, no, era lo mismo que los petroleros entraron, lo mismo, decían, tomen cola y firmen, ¿no? Y eso como se fueron y decían, ya hicimos consulta consentimiento, ¿no? Decían, eso era engaño y también era, claramente también se sintieron que no podían como ese rato vieron que con la cultura diferente, que no hablan propio idioma, era trampa también que estaban ya bajando. Y los jueces reaccionaron como ya no querían tener más apertura a dar y decían que iban a suspender y dijimos vamos a levantar a cantar. Entonces nos paramos todos al frente y no paramos de cantar y no sabían qué hacer ellos. Los jueces entre ellos miraban y nosotros levantamos y cantamos. Y ese canto también era muy fuerte, diciendo que nosotros con todo corazón, con todo, es nuestra casa, nosotros debemos decir, nadie puede venir ni imponer y sacar, ni menos que estaban cuidando la tierra. Era que cuidaban nuestro ancestro y nosotros estamos en nuestro hogar. Y nuestra casa debe ser respetada. Era como una música como salió muy, muy, muy poderoso y los jueces entre ellos miraban, no podían ni interpretar y eso fue como muy poderosa de mi parte. Yo me siento muy orgullosa de ese compartir, que tan poderoso hicimos cambiar en el Corte Constitucional de Ecuador.
Memo said that the court proceedings went on for many days, and it was a small courtroom, and so we jam-packed the courtroom, Guarani women and warriors, but a lot of people couldn't enter in, and so there was outside in the hallway, there were chants happening all the time. We could hear our warriors dancing in the hallways outside the courtroom, and it went on for so many days, and the Guarani people had come from the forest to be there to witness history, to take on the government, to protect our lands, didn't want to leave. They didn't want to go anywhere. And so there was even one woman who was pregnant and she gave birth outside the courthouse. She didn't want to leave, didn't want to go to the hospital. And there were so many midwives amongst the Warani that they actually were able to, she gave birth outside the courthouse, and we could hear we could hear the cries of a newborn baby in one of the days of the court proceedings. And then inside the courthouse, there was all these different moments, you know, where like what I told you, where one of our elders didn't want to swear the whole truth, nothing but the whole truth, help you God. There was all these moments where the judge, there was a panel of judges and we were reading, they were making motions and things like that, that sometimes we felt they were going against us, you know. And so there was one moment where we decided, you know what? The judges are going to be siding right now with the government lawyers. And so we are going to not let this happen right now. And so we just stood up. I grabbed my elder's hand and we had a sign, stood up, and we began singing. And we sang and sang and sang, and we saw the government lawyers' faces and the judges. They did not know what to do with us. And we just kept singing and filled the entire courthouse with song until finally the judges said, okay, the courtroom is suspended. We canceled proceedings for the day. And for us, we felt like we had just won a moral and spiritual victory against a system that was trying to disenfranchise us.
Sounds like my kind of law, which is good. And I don't want to spoil this story, but it's public. So the case was successful. So the case was about whether there was consent from the people, essentially, and the court ultimately ruled in your favour that there wasn't consent, and the effect of that was to protect, certainly in the short term, 500,000 acres of rainforest. That's a big enough achievement for any leader, any activist, but I sense it's not the end. So I wonder what's next for you and what's next for Amazon Frontlines. Yeah, and it's such important work, and certainly chimes with some of the priorities that we have, and to some extent it's humbling to hear the scale of the ambition. We're up against time, so I wanted to ask finally, Nemonte, whether there was a message that she wanted to leave us with before we go to questions.
Desde que recibimos preguntas.
Pues yo dejaría mensajes para detener cambio climático, es muy importante, es desde aquí, digamos, desde su comunidad, digamos, desde su comunidad de tener conciencia y también dar solidaridad a los pueblos indígenas y también cambiar, ¿no? Conectar colectividad de comunidad, cómo pueden desde aquí aportar lo que respeta a la Amazonía, porque yo siento que ya hemos ganado esa lucha, la batalla, pero siento como ese sistema a nuestras comunidades llega a la puerta de amenaza y día a día, porque nuestro territorio es uno de los diversidad más grande del mundo. Ahí debajo tenemos petróleo. El mundo de afuera miran que es petróleo. Para mis ancestros, para mi pueblo, es sangre de mis ancestros, es sagrado que no se pueden extraer y dejar, porque todo ella, la madre, nos da el oxígeno en el mundo. Entonces, para eso necesitamos la alianza que apoyen en forma de recursos y también la difusión de redes sociales y que no solamente que den recursos y que olviden, sino sea la colectividad desde aquí a allá podemos hacer el cambio muy bonito y seguir protegiendo para el futuro.
Mm.
Thank you. It's an extremely powerful message to finish on, and it's a very clear call to action, and certainly something we can all reflect on. Mitch and Nemonte, I want to thank you not just for producing the book and telling such a fantastic story, but for your leadership generally and your communication of this message globally as part of this process. So thank you. Are there any questions in the room? We're very over time, but we're just going to keep going because it's fascinating.
Podría decir, mayoría son aquí abogados.
Yeah.
Yo tengo mi abogada abuela. Si quieren conocer más ley de los pueblos, pueden ir a visitar a mi abogada. Tiene 85 años, está muy mayor. Ella siempre está diciendo a mí, Nemo, ¿cómo estás? Yo te voy a guiar con mi sabiduría, con mi argumento para que podamos ganar al mundo, dice ella.
So the question was, how would Nemonte and Mitch feel if their children ultimately wanted to leave the forest?
Yo creo que mi niña nació en la selva, en la hamaca, sentada. Y ella tiene como dos culturas, ¿no? Parte del papá es de California, la abuela vive en California. Ella desde niña ha ido, ama mucho a la abuela, quiere bastante. Pero ella siempre dice, mi paraíso es la selva, mamá. Porque la selva me da libre, dice. Afuera en ciudad me quedo como encarcelado, no tengo libertad, no puedo yo sentir libremente de ir, correr, subir en árbol, así dice, y ella como, yo realmente amo a mi hija y realmente quizás desde mi herencia y como tenemos selva, por eso sigo como luchando para que ella, mi hija grande en futuro puede vivir en la selva, puede estar dos mundos. Si ella quiere salir, ser académica, también puede ir, salir afuera a estudiar, pero que vuelva a su tierra natal, que pueda seguir ayudando y protegiendo, respetando a la madre naturaleza.
So the question is essentially, how do we in the West, in what you call in the book the civilized world, but I'd question that, how we in the West can overcome that alienation, how we can reconnect with nature.
Todos estamos conectados con la tierra, sí. No estamos alejados, estamos caminando con la tierra. El problema es, gente de aquí están conectados a espiritualidad. Ese es el problema, la espiritualidad. Si volvemos a conectar nuestra espiritualidad, aunque estamos en África o en selva, vamos a estar felices con nuestra familia. Eso necesitan recuperar porque yo siento, es muy difícil de ese sistema, ¿no? Pero algo muy bonito pueden crear, es la comunidad donde ustedes habitan, de poner a hablar con sus vecinos en su trabajo, de recuperar, de encontrar ese círculo de la familia, que lo que hace daño el consumismo, de lo que daña nuestra salud, como decir, como es trabajo personal, es como pasó a mí, yo salí sacada de los evangélicos, yo creí que esta vida afuera es bueno, ¿no? Y luego di cuenta que era nadie iba a salvar, estaba mal camino, ¿no? Y di cuenta que realmente uno se puede posesionar y eso cambia todo. Puedes ayudar y también educar dentro de la casa de que tú alimentas, ¿no? Yo veo que aquí es muy difícil la vida de aquí, que no saben de dónde viene comida. Ahora es como la tecnología y el mercado grande y traen, y sus propios hijos no están enseñando de dónde viene la comida, cómo se prepara. Entonces sería muy bueno, ¿no? Desde casa, de que no compren los plásticos. A mí me da mucho triste cuando yo estoy aquí caminando, veo planta que no es real, es plástico. ¿Cómo tú educas? Desde ahí imparte la conexión con la naturaleza espiritual. Y yo cuando camino y toco, pienso que es árbol y veo plástico y yo me siento como no puedo conectar y me hace triste. Cuando yo toco a la planta así natural, como me conecto. La planta tiene vida.
Thank you. Well, I'm sure we could draw on this wisdom for hours to come, but I think we need to draw to an end, unfortunately, not least because you have another book launch event to go to. But on behalf of those of us in the room and on behalf of the sort of broader Mishkan Academy community that have been online, just want to say thank you for being so open and honest today and for such an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Yo tengo, antes de cerrar, agradecer a ti por ese espacio. Si quieren más aprender sobre la espiritualidad de sanación, nos podrían contactar interno en correo, y también recomendar también que vengan a visitar y tomar las plantas sagradas que te puede ayudar a reconectar nuevamente. Entonces sería muy bueno.
I will take you up on all of those offers. Okay. I think there's also some pieces of paper around with QR codes that talk about Amazon Frontlines, so please feel free to learn some more about Amazon Frontlines. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody.